The library was my space, and there was just so much.
To the Harbor Grace excursion with the boys to have a time.
And hello, everybody. It's really a joy to be with you tonight. I look forward to this conversation. Before I begin, I want to say how much I absolutely love this book. It is filled with tremendous, interesting information, surprises, deep research, lots of opinions. And if you want any kind of device to just take the temperature of the nation, this book is an amazing diagnostic tool. So I look forward to exploring it with you. The title arrived at my office with some surprise because Breaking Point, the new big shifts putting Canada at risk, landed at a moment when we are celebrating national unity. This is like elbows up, everyone singing "O Canada" before every event with gusto. It seems like the country is more unified than ever, but here comes this book saying it's not. So how come?
Sure. There was an elbows up period, although you notice that I find the elbows up stuff has pretty much dissipated. But it's not just a question of what's happening in our politics in this week or in this month. Canada has reached a very dangerous situation, and it had reached it well before Donald Trump became president. In some ways, he's the catalyst that sort of accelerated everything that had been going on before. It's not in the book, but we came up with it afterwards, but it's a gloriously mixed metaphor. We kicked so many cans down the road, and now the chicken's coming home to roost. And those chickens are both sort of horizontal and vertical. So horizontally, we have very dangerous levels of alienation in different parts of the country. As you know, the Parti Québécois is likely to win the next election, likely to hold a referendum, a third referendum on separation. And the polls say, well, they'll lose, but you don't go into those things with any sort of confidence. You never know what's going to happen. And at the same time, in the prairie provinces, Alberta and Saskatchewan, there is also a very deep level of alienation, and there's also a possibility of a referendum on separation. So we have not just the traditional English-Quebec, English-French challenge. We also have the regional challenge of the Laurentian Centre versus an alienated West. So that's the horizontal challenge that we face, and it's I think in some ways more grave than it's ever been almost at any time in the life of the country. And then there's a vertical challenge. We have the first generation of young people who will not live as well as those who came before them. The first generation of people who won't live as well as their parents did. They don't have the prospects of housing that our generations had, that the boomers and the Gen X had. They don't have the secure jobs that we have. They don't even know what a defined benefit pension is, let alone getting one. In fact, I just saw a story today. They're giving up on the prospects of ever being able to own a car. And so they're angry. They're angry that they have been engineered out of the kind of life that their parents and grandparents enjoyed. And they're expected to work and to pay for the growing demands of boomers like me as we get older and sicker. And they're very angry too. So those are the two the generational and the regional alienation that was here and getting worse even before Donald Trump took his oath.
So I look forward to, maybe look forward is the wrong word. I am curious to explore each of those topics in further depth. But before we do that, I want to know about how you work together. So as you can see, we have two authors here, which is not typical for this type of event. Usually books have a single author. How did you come together? You've done this before. What's the origin of your partnership, and how does it work?
Oh, I look forward to hearing this.
Well, I know how it came together. John and I have been friends for a long time. And I used to run, at the time, the Angus Reid office, and after that, the Ipsos office in Ottawa. And I met John many, many years ago. And every time that we got together, and one thing you will discover is a place like Ottawa is a very small town. and everybody gets to meet everybody after a while. It's just like the literary community is a very small group of people. The media community is a very small group of people. Everybody, even if Sarah and I are meeting for the first time tonight, I'm pretty sure she knew who I was, and I definitely knew who she was, even if we'd never met. So it's that kind of a world. And what ends up happening is you find people who you really enjoy speaking with. And John was somebody I always really enjoyed speaking with, and it came about as a result of a book that I think they have over there, or maybe they don't, or they do or they don't, called The Big Shift.
They might have it upstairs.
They have it here at the library for sure. And that was one where John and I remember I was coming back from Heathrow. I was in Heathrow, and I saw a presentation that John gave on TVO about the death of the Laurentian consensus. So if you've ever heard the term Laurentian consensus or Laurentian elite, here is the author. He was the guy who came up with those terms. They were popularized, I would say, in the book, The Big Shift, that we wrote together. But I phoned him from Heathrow and said, you know what, you have an interesting idea, but you need some data. And he also said, yeah, but nobody would ever want to have a book, right, publish a book on this. I said, leave that with me. And so what happened was John, he's always very feisty about these things. He's got, very big about deadlines, and, he doesn't like to write proposals, and he gets, very fusty about this kind of stuff. So the publisher that we were working with at the time, I had been working with, and I phoned them up and I told them about the idea, and he said, oh, this could be pretty interesting. So anyway, John and I got together, we put together a short proposal, sent it off to the publisher didn't like it. And he said, election books don't sell. It's true, they don't. And so he said, but I've heard you, and he was talking about me, talk about much bigger ideas, about where the country is going, how the population is changing, how people have tons and tons of myths of their head about what this country is that no longer apply. That book I would be interested in, and I can also see what John is talking about is like that as well. So why don't you do that? So I phoned John up, and of course he was very upset that we were asking to revise the proposal. Doesn't like to revise proposals. But we did, and went in, and he said, this is fabulous, let's do it. Now, so this is how people write who work together. They get a writing cabin, and they go away, and they spend 3 months writing a book.
I've seen that in the movies.
Yeah, no. We hardly ever talk. We hardly ever talk. He writes things, I write things, and we exchange them. And we just go back and forth. And Doug Pepper, our editor, is sitting right there. He knows how, he's edited 2 of our books. He knows how we work.
Is this a Google Doc or like email?
No, we just email back and forth. And every once in a while, I'll send him a text saying, I just saw this, you should maybe take this into account. And he'll do the same with me. But rarely pick up the phone and say, hey, let's talk about this. No, we don't do that. It's very back and forth because we're working fast. And by the time we get to the end of it, he's written the parts that he said he's going to commit to, and I've written the parts that I said I'm going to commit to. And then John does what we call a write-through, where he writes through the final piece and works with the editor, the copy editor, to make sure that the voice is the voice that we want, and it sounds like one person, not 2 people writing, and that there's it really reflects what we set out to do in the proposal of the book. So that's how we do it.
And we've done it 3 times now.
Yeah, we've done it 3 times.
And what time frame, John, was this book? I know you like to write fast. You wanted to get it out quickly. The news is changing all the time. When did you have the idea for this book, and how long did it take to emerge?
So as Darrell said, I can't stand process, right? And we ended up in a phone call with Frank Gifford, who was the editor at HarperCollins. Jim Gifford, sorry, who was the editor at HarperCollins at the time. And Jim was saying, this is a great proposal. We should do more of this. We should do more of that. And I said, no, that's it. That's it. No more of this. This book has got to come out, and it's got to come out now. We will get you a book in 6 months. And if we get you a book in 6 months, you will publish the book in 6 months. And if you will agree to publish the book in 6 months after we give it to you in 6 months, then we have a deal. Otherwise, we don't have a deal. And I remember Jim saying, can you write it in that tone of voice?
Yeah, we don't have to do this with Doug Pepper because he already knows that's how we work. So
I said, yes, I can. We can do it in that tone of voice. And so that's it. We wrote Big Shift in 6 months, and HarperCollins had it out. And 6 months later. And this breaking point came because we wanted to do an essay for the Globe and Mail in which we said, Well, everything we said in The Big Shift turned out to be true, but we missed the fact that it was tearing the country apart. And so we wrote that as an essay in the Globe, but it was very heavily read. There was a lot of reaction to it in the Globe and Mail among readers. So we went to Doug Pepper and said, do you want to do it again? We'll write it in 6 months. You publish it in 6 months? And Doug said, sure. So we started in the middle of December.
Yeah, it's really
we transmitted on the 6th day of June, I remember, and published on the 25th of October.
And where was that in the whole Trump-Carney 51st state?
It was happening as this was going on. And in fact, we thought when we were originally starting out, just like everybody else who was talking about Canadian politics, we thought we were going to get a different result. So we started writing this when Pierre Poilievre was ahead by 25. But then it just the writing evolved as the political events evolved. But honestly, I think the maybe some political shading, like 5 or 10%, was affected by that. Basically, what we were going to write about was already locked in before any of this was happening.
Right. So the divides and challenges underneath the surface of this great national moment were there and continue to be there. Speaking of the Globe and Mail, I don't know if any of you read an article recently by Jason Stanley, the political philosopher who has moved to Canada, who wrote a piece about how to cope with authoritarianism. And he was sort of giving advice to Canada based on what he had seen in Ukraine with Putin. And his number one piece of advice to Canada on how to resist encroaching authoritarianism was a country must be unified to defend itself. And I saw that when I was reading your book, and it shook me a little bit, because you're arguing we are not secure in our sense of unity, and nowhere is that clearer than, as you mentioned before, Alberta. So I'd like to spend a minute or two talking about Alberta, which has a separatist faction. And first, I'd like to hear a little bit about how big that faction is from your research, and a little bit of your theorizing as to why it exists.
So there's a whole chapter on, we don't call it the West, we call it the Wests, because there is not one Western province. There's several different versions of what Western Canada is, and it varies by whether you're urban or rural or whatever. So to understand what's going on there, you really need to understand specifically what's happening. And they have somewhat of a common history, because they came together in a very similar way. After the rest of the country had come together, they came together a little bit later. Their treatment by what was happening in central Canada, at the time Quebec and Ontario principally, was something that has defined who they've become over time. So this idea that they're treated not as really full members almost, they're almost treated like colonies, that's their belief. And in Alberta, that feeling is quite deep. This idea that Alberta is there to be the provider of wealth to Canada, which it does, that it is there to support the rest of the country. In many ways it does, but not to really ever be listened to. And in particularly in situations in which they're not well represented in the government. So the Trudeau government, a very good example of that, but also the Carney government, where they're not very well represented. You put that together with the current context and you see where the combustibility is. If you want to know what the numbers are probably about 30% of the population in Alberta today, if you voted asked them to vote on the question of sovereignty, would vote yes. Now, yeah, that all has to be tested through the course of a referendum, but anybody who watched Brexit or watched the 1995 referendum in Quebec know that these things can take off like wildfire. So I would say that what worries me more about Alberta as a sovereignty proposition than Quebec is Quebec tends to be kind of more of a romantic notion of what Quebec could be as a separate nation in Canada. Alberta is driven overwhelmingly by grievance. What the day after is going to be, not a lot of thought given, not a lot of care given to it right now. But the expression of anger about how they believe that they've been treated by the rest of the nation, particularly Laurentian Canada, is what is driving this.
John, I have a question for you about that. We published in Maclean's a sort of photo essay where we went and found a bunch of these separatists, and they expressed their thinking for why they were so mad and why they wanted their own state and they wanted to leave the country. And it was kind of incoherent. Like what they articulated was all the grievances that you are apt to find in almost any sort of outraged, disappointed social movement of today. Food costs too much, my kids can't get ahead, can't find housing, too many immigrants. They'd say that in a kind of veiled way. And it was like a pile of annoyances and disappointments. I didn't hear so much Ottawa has all the power. Like, it wasn't articulated like that. It was sort of like all these things that are upsetting to me, and it's going to take the shape of a national movement. Is that how you diagnose it?
Not quite. I mean, the leaders of the movement, first of all, aren't the leaders of a movement. I don't think it qualifies as a movement in the way that the Parti Québécois manifests itself as the embodiment of the separatist movement within Quebec. There's not that political equivalent. There is no René Lévesque there. So that's one big difference. But it really manifests itself in something that's much deeper. First of all, as Darrell said, it's historical. The provinces were not initially given control of natural resources. They eventually got it, but already you had that sense of, well, we'll call you a province, but you're not going to be a full province, not like Ontario and Quebec are. And then came the national energy policy, early 1980s, which still makes them spit when they talk about it. And then came Justin Trudeau. And one of the core arguments in the book is that nothing drives this country apart more than federal governments that believe they have to act in the national interest. And you can put scare quotes in the national interest. And the national interest is whatever Toronto and Ottawa and Montreal think is the national interest. And Justin Trudeau was a classic example of that kind of government, where whether it was environment or healthcare or childcare, they went into areas of provincial jurisdiction and said, here's what we want to do, here's how we are going to either bribe you or coerce you into agreeing to do what it is we want to do. And Ontario kind of shrugged and said, okay, fine, that's all right, we're represented. And Quebec kind of shrugged as well and said, no, these are the same values that we have. But in Western Canada, it's who do you think you are? You know, why are you coming out here telling us that you've decided that we should have $10 a day child care and you are going to compel us to do it? Why do we have to pay your carbon tax? And that's really what drives the anger in the Western Canada, the sense that the Laurentian elites in central Canada decide what they think the national interest is, and then they impose it on the rest of the country, not being aware of the fact that a third of that country now is growing in population, growing in prosperity, contributing more and more of its wealth to the center, and not being given the proper appreciation. And one of the things that we argue in the book is, if you look at Stephen Harper's government and you look at Justin Trudeau's government, whatever else you think about Stephen Harper and Justin Trudeau, the Federation was never more at peace than it was under Stephen Harper. And the reason it was never more at peace, the only time in my life, period, that we didn't talk about, what does Quebec want was during the 10 years of Harper. And that's because Harper religiously stayed out of areas of provincial jurisdiction. And then as soon as Justin Trudeau came in and got back into areas of provincial jurisdiction, the Bloc Québécois surges back in Quebec, because it was death's door. The Parti Québécois is about to come to power provincially, and we have sovereignty acts being passed in Saskatchewan and Alberta. That's what happens when provincial governments, federal governments interfere in areas of provincial jurisdiction.
In a certain way, the book is a report card on Justin Trudeau, and he does not get a really great grade. And nowhere else you're critical of his prime ministership in many ways, but the part that resonated for me was how he managed immigration policy, and you make a convincing case and a nuanced case. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about that, either of you.
Okay, so on the analysis of Justin Trudeau's leadership, we're very clear about what our definition of success is. So we say basically any government over time, historically, will be judged as to being whether good or bad for Canada if it performs on three big things. You might have a different three than John and I have, but we had three. And they were, what's happening in the economy? Is it working? Number two, what is our national unity situation? The primary responsibility of any prime minister is to keep this country whole and together. And then the third one is our relationship with the United States. We don't have any choice but to manage that well, just given the geography and the economy and the defense situation that we're in. So our assessment was based on that. How are we on each of these three things? And I think any objective analyst would have to say not as well after 10 years as we were before that 10 years started. So that's how we evaluate Justin Trudeau. We're not completely negative on Justin Trudeau. We give him a lot of credit on recognition of Indigenous rights. We had a very beautiful introduction here in land acknowledgement. We give him a lot of credit on things like, for example, childcare.
And that was, honestly, I was like, are there any other things they give him credit for? I mean, I'm not saying it's not fair, but that's slightly damning with fake praise.
Well, there's kind of those big three, and then they're the essentials, and then everything else is kind of nice, if you can do it. But if you can't succeed on those three, we're not a country. And that's what he struggled with. And if you can take a look at Jean Chrétien, you can look at Stephen Harper, you can look at Justin Trudeau's father, you can look at Brian Mulroney, all these prime ministers, those were the three that if you go back historically and look at what their places in Canadian history, those are the things that they're evaluated on. So I don't think it's an unfair assessment. Yes, you can go through and you can find things that I think people in this room and other rooms that we would go to would say, well, it's better, this thing is better as a result of what Justin Trudeau did, but that's nice, but those three things that we focused are on the needs. You need to perform well on those.
And some of the things are not exclusive to Justin Trudeau at all. We have a large section on defense, where we say defense policy is foreign policy is trade policy. It's a sort of a mantra in the book. Defense policy is foreign policy is trade policy. And Jean Chrétien ran down the military. Stephen Harper, after Afghanistan, ran down the military. So there are areas where we can look to liberal and conservative governments who failed to address situations, and then Justin Trudeau inherited that situation. But I think my big problem with Justin Trudeau, and it is a very, very big problem for me, I think he will go down as one of the worst prime ministers in Canada's history. And he will go down as one of the worst prime ministers in Canada's history for this reason, which is he broke immigration. We were almost unique in the world. Darrell, I think we might have been unique in the world, in that a majority of people believed that immigration was good for Canada. You couldn't get a majority of people saying that in Germany or in most, anywhere in Europe, Australia, New Zealand. But here in Canada, we said, immigration is great. We support it, healthy majorities.
And most of the people who said that were immigrants. Or immigrants
or the
of
children
one generation
of
prior.
So we had this notion that multiculturalism works, immigration works. We bring in more people on a per capita basis than anywhere else in the country, anywhere else in the world, and they do well. They make for fabulous cities. They make for fabulous communities, and for the first time now since 2000. A majority of people believe there are too many immigrants coming into the country. And it's not that there's some new nativism emerging out of the population. They think there are too many immigrants coming into the country because there are too many immigrants coming into the country. He moved the permanent residence level from 250 to 500,000. And there's an argument for that. I wrote columns in support of the fact that we need to steadily increase the number of permanent residents coming into the country on the economic class, not so much on the family class, but on the economic class. But then he removed essentially all the limits on temporary foreign workers and removed all the limits on international students. And suddenly Statistics Canada said, did you realize there were all these people, 7% of the population is not part of the population, but either temporary or students? And they didn't know. And these kids were 8 people to an apartment. And I think it's probably an exaggeration that they stressed the healthcare system and that they increased prices, housing prices. But the fact remains that generally in the country, most people came to the conclusion that the immigration system had let them down, that the immigration system was broken. And when you lose that, you lose the one great consensus that this country had. A unique consensus. And to have lost that, and to have now, how many years will it take, if ever, that we will be able to reestablish that belief? That is a terrible legacy for a prime minister.
You mentioned earlier, you've talked about geographical divides or regional divides. You also talked about demographic, generational divides in terms of the age cohorts. I confess I've had a lot of conversations with boomers, I'm a proud member of Gen X, who just don't get it. They're like, well, we worked hard and we just, we didn't go on all those fancy trips and meals for Instagram. So we saved money and we were able to build our lives. And I was impressed that that is not how you saw it. I guess partly your eyes have been opened by research and good reporting. But there is a real lack of understanding of one generation to the next. And why do you see this as a danger that could break the country or harm?
Well, if there's a single theme that John and I have through all three books that we've written, it's about demographic change. And it is one of those things that everybody, like that Mark Twain quote, it's not the things that you that you don't know that get you into trouble. It's the things that you know for sure that happen to be wrong that get you into trouble. And on demography, we're mostly wrong. We still think that there's this huge population growth in Canada. No, the Canadian population is actually going to decline over the next few years. We think that
Because we're not having babies.
We're stopped having babies. So there's a book over there that you can, or in the shelves upstairs, that you can read that's been translated into 10 languages, and John and I are extremely proud of the work that we did on that, called Empty Planet, and you'll find out that the world has stopped having kids. The global population is going to peak in the next couple of decades, and it's going to start to decline, and how low it goes, nobody really knows, because everybody stopped having kids. And so
Do you remember when we used to worry about overpopulation?
Yeah.
No.
I feel like it was like 10 minutes ago.
We were writing the book, everyone,
They told us they were nuts.
People reaction would be, you're kidding me, right? Let me get this straight. You think it's population decline that matters? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's not just population decline, it's population aging. So when you reduce the number, the only growth that takes place in the Canadian population now is as a result of immigration, which we've now destroyed, as John has correctly pointed out, at a time when we need immigrants more than we ever have, and population aging. We're not dying as fast as we used to. In 1950s, or the 1920s, the average Canadian lived to the age of 57. Today, they live to the age of 82. Almost all of our population growth is immigration and people not dying as fast as they did. The math doesn't work for younger people. This math does not work for younger people. They're the ones who are going to have to pick up the bill for paying for all of this, and you're going to see the seniors' dependency ratio expand very rapidly as we move into the 2030s, and the issue that John was talking about, that vertical cleavage between generations, is going to become very pronounced.
And I know we'll talk about this later. There are solutions in this book. we don't just lament.
I think we could go right into that now. So now, this.
Before people start joking, but you're on a lower floor, so you're not going to do anything. It's okay.
I found the most creative and, hopeful, but also just like surprising and delightful notions. Obviously, you're practiced diagnosticians. You are collecting the data, observing the world, and then you move into this other mode, which is maybe not as comfortable or as common for you in your work of like, how could this be better? That's like the imaginative part. Did that feel different to you to be?
Can I just say, this was a John thing. He said, it's not enough to just say what's wrong. We're going to challenge ourselves this time and try and come up with some ideas about how to do this. So there's 2 chapters at the end of the book. One is called the Crises of Crisis, or Crisis of Crises, and the other one's called The Big Fix. So I think I did the first draft of the Crisis of Crises. And John said, God, this is so unrelentingly negative. We have an obligation to write the next part. And so he had some ideas that he gave me, and then I went and got some ideas, and I think I did the first draft of the Big Fix. But John certainly changed what I wrote, because we do these things very much together. And that was our attempt to say we have a greater obligation than just pointing out problems. We don't want this to be a, what do they call it, Jeremiah or
So,
whatever.
John, you were about to say something about the young people and their lack of prospects and hope, and how you have a solution or a proposed solution.
A bunch of different solutions. By the way, there's an entire chapter on Indigenous issues also in the solutions section, because again, full credit to Justin Trudeau for putting Indigenous issues in the front burner. And then we think there are tremendous opportunities for huge progress in First Nations and other Indigenous peoples over the course of the next few years. And all it requires is the recognition on all sides, which I think is growing, that what you see as a challenge, it could actually be a tremendous opportunity that could lead to permanent prosperity. We think on the generational front, first of all, we think the boomers have got to stop grabbing so much. One of the worst things that Justin
How do you mandate that?
Yeah, well, for example, Stephen Harper raised the retirement age for OAS, and Justin Trudeau brought it back down to 65. No. Pensions should be arriving much later. The people who have, like the CPP, should be contributing what it is they take out of it. There should be. We talk about the need for reduced tuition for students, work placement programs for students, the co-op placement programs, so they can actually translate their education into work. There are other things that can be done that allow younger people to work with older people and for older people as a means of getting into the workforce. Do you want to add?
Yeah, I was going to say, I think the single most interesting one that I've been playing with these days is, and we wrote about in the book, is the idea of finding a way to transfer wealth between generations without having the government stick their ladle in. There should be a way for families to find a way to be able to help children buy their next home, or to pass on family wealth without the government getting in the way. Yes, there needs to be something there for people who don't have the ability to do this in their families. But the idea that every dollar that gets tracked in the economy, the way that we're going to direct it in the right way is through government, is wrong. We should allow families to make more of these decisions for themselves. So we talk about that in the book.
And just as an anecdotal add to that, and then we can move on to other stuff. I don't know about you, but I'm a boomer. The number of my friends and colleagues and acquaintances who have, children in their 20s or 30s who are liquidating their own assets so that they can provide a down payment for their kids is amazing. They're selling the cottage, they're getting rid of that European trip fund because they realize that the bank of mom and dad are the only hope that their kids have of being able to have a home of their own. And of course, there are so many people in the country who don't have a cottage, who don't have that bank of mom and dad, and there's nothing they can give those children. And that's a tremendous risk and strain on the country.
Can I add one more stat in here, just because I like statistics, and you'll like this one too. You know that 47% of the people who live in the Greater Toronto Area who are between the ages of 18 and 35 live with their mums and dads. Half. That's what we're up against.
One of the more surprising enthusiasms you have in the book is for the suburbs. So we're always pulling our hair out in this country about the housing crisis. There are 42 different ways we're trying to solve it. We've tried to solve it by building tiny little condos that go way up into the sky. What is it that you like about the suburbs?
So,
downtown Toronto journalists don't usually advocate for suburban sprawl.
I participate in the editorial board of the Globe and Mail, and I'm a voice of one when I talk about the line we have in the book is sprawl, baby, sprawl. Because the conventional wisdom is no, we need to put fourplexes and sixplexes into established neighborhoods. We need densification in established communities. But the problem with that is simple. That's not how most people grew up, and that's not how they want to grow up. They want a three-bedroom house with a backyard. They grew up in a three-bedroom house with a backyard, and they want a three-bedroom house with a backyard. They want a barbecue. right? They want to be able to let the dog out to run around. And you can't do any of those things in a mid-rise apartment. I'm not against mid-rise apartments. I think they're fine for those who want them. But it's not easy to have a kid, especially 2 kids, in an apartment like that. And so the only place where you can have new affordable housing that's 3 bedrooms and has a backyard is where we put all the affordable housing from the end of the Second World War until just very recently. We put it in the suburbs. And if we want, again, if the focus is on the millennials and on Gen Z, what do they need? What can we get for them? How can we help them to live better lives? Then we have to give them what it is they want. And if you ask them what they want, they say, let me own a house like the house I grew up in, one that had 3 bedrooms and a backyard and a barbecue. And there's only one place that house can go.
And can I just add one thing to that? It's not just about housing. It's about middle-class success. So it is about what is the thing that when you go and ask a person, and we do this all the time, that really symbolizes that you have made it in your life. And it is what John described. The types of housing that we're building in Toronto in a lot of instances in the downtowns these days are the houses that people endure. They're not the houses that they want. When you ask them what they want, middle-class status achievement, they will want to live in what John describes. Now, maybe we can change an entire history of what people regard as middle-class achievement in Canada. Maybe we can work that out, or maybe we can just give people what they want.
I'm going to ask a couple more questions, and then we're going to open it up to you, because I'm sure you have questions of your own. So I'll give you a minute or two to think of things if you have them. In the meantime, I want to ask you about one of your more fanciful notions, which is some version of break government departments in Ottawa, break Ottawa, spread it out across the country to address like regional disaffection and alienation by locating pockets of the government across the country. I want to hear a little bit about it. I want to know if you think this is even like remotely possible.
I'll start. And then, some of the ideas are out there to get a conversation going. Because what we want to really talk about is the need for 2 things: for the federal government to stop interfering in areas of provincial jurisdiction, thus causing anger and alienation within those jurisdictions, and the need for the different regions of the country to feel that the federal government is their government. And right now, many of them don't. They don't because most of the federal government is in Ottawa. And one of the reasons the federal government is in Ottawa, and all the departments, is the bilingualism requirement. You have to have English and French. But 18% of this country speaks English and French, and you know, the rest of it doesn't. And those people are almost all within 100 kilometers of the Ontario-Quebec border or the Quebec-New Brunswick border. So that makes the federal public service, frankly, white. It makes it heavily francophone. It excludes from the federal public service many immigrants who are quite bilingual, just not in French and English. And again, it makes different parts of the country feel that Ottawa doesn't represent them. And you know why they feel that? Because it doesn't represent them. So what we argued is that for every department that is not a core federal responsibility, so you keep defense in Ottawa, you keep justice in Ottawa, you keep finance in Ottawa, keep foreign affairs in Ottawa. But for all the other areas of shared jurisdiction, move them out of the capital. And not just an office, the entire department has to go. The minister is gone, the deputy minister is gone, all the senior ranks are gone. And cabinet meetings can be virtual at least part of the time. My favorite idea in the whole book is that we should put the Canada Council in Saskatoon. How would it change how would it change the arts system in this country if the Canada Council were in Saskatoon? The minister, the deputy minister, all the officers there, and they had to shop at the supermarket in Saskatoon and hear what people thought they wanted to see on television, what books they wanted to read. It would be a profound difference. So yeah, I don't think it's likely that we'll get a federal government that breaks the departments and sends them all to different, fisheries goes to Halifax and Parks Canada goes to Banff and so on. But it's the idea that we have to get this Laurentian notion of the federal government out of our system so that all parts of the country look at the federal government and think it's their government and not just the ones around here.
Okay, so here's my last question before I turn it over to the audience. It may be for both of you. If Trudeau gets a C+ grade in this book, how are you feeling about our current prime minister? So in the book, you argue enthusiastically about beefing up our military. You talk about finding new trade partners. It's almost like Carney read the book and is taking orders. So what is your assessment at the moment?
Well, more than our assessment, I think what Canadians think. Canadians are actually quite happy.
The data guy answer.
Yeah, sorry about that. Yeah, well, everybody can have an opinion, but the numbers for him are actually quite encouraging. In fact, in some ways, to his detriment. And the reason it's to his detriment is because he's getting everything that he wants. People are happy. They don't want to have an election. In fact, the numbers supporting having an election and the Liberals going for a majority right now have declined since over the last couple of months. But people are basically happy with what they're seeing. They hired him to do one job, and that's the one that he's doing right now. The unfortunate problem for him is that all the other stuff that John and I are talking about, that's what his real problems are going to be. Yes, there's the trade situation, there's the international relations situation, there's the defense, although he has to deliver on that, expenditures that they're making, but the things that are really going to challenge him are the ones that are related to national unity, both vertical and horizontal, and quite frankly, we really haven't seen him even express his point of view on that. So far, I would say shows promise, but he seems to be really good at in gym class, but all the other stuff, that you really evaluate what his career is going to be based on. So he's really good at traveling. He's good on the clubs in the school. But on the things that are eventually going to be the real challenges facing Canada, domestic challenges are going to be facing Canada, we don't really have much of a signal from him yet.
Yeah, I think this is not the read of the book. There's a question of Pierre Poilievre being less and less popular. But remember, he was 25 points ahead of Justin Trudeau. Now he's a good 10 or more points behind.
Use our polling, John, 8.
Behind Mark Carney. But I remember when Stephen Harper became leader of the new Conservative Party of Canada, and everybody said, it hasn't got a hope against Paul Martin. Could you imagine that man beating Paul Martin? As it turns out, yes, you could. And I think if there isn't an election, and we get to, let's say, this time next year, say winter of 2027, those tariffs have been biting now for another year. The CUSMA talks have ended up wherever the CUSMA talks have ended up, but they're going to end up with higher tariffs. You just know they are. The economy is dragging, and again, young people are even further behind than they were before.
There's a referendum in Alberta.
And we've had perhaps a referendum in Alberta, certainly one coming up in Quebec. And it's not Donald Trump anymore. It's what's becoming of our country. That's the question. And you might be surprised where the polls are a year from now if it's all about affordability and not about Donald Trump.